Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Alan Arthur Barnes murder. We begin our journey in a city known for its elegance and its order, a place of stone cathedrals and sprawling parklands. This is Adelaide, South Australia, in the late 1970s. To many, it was the city of churches, a quiet, colonial pocket of the world where the pace of life matched the gentle flow of the River Torrens. But beneath this surface of suburban tranquility, a darkness was beginning to coil, a series of events that would eventually haunt the collective memory of the nation. Tonight, we go back to the very beginning, to a night that felt like any other, before the name of the family murders became a whispered terror in every household. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the mist of the past rise around you. It is the evening of June 18, 1979. In the southern hemisphere, June brings the deepening chill of winter. The air in Adelaide is crisp and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from the chimneys of the older sandstone villas. The sky is a bruised purple, fading into a deep, ink-wash black as the sun disappears behind the Gulf St. Vincent. On this particular Monday night, the streets are relatively still. The yellow glow of the street lamps reflects off the damp pavement, creating long, shimmering ribbons of amber light that stretch toward the horizon. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a city like Adelaide in the wintertime, a hushed expectation, as if the houses themselves are huddling together against the biting wind that rolls down from the Adelaide hills. Moving through this cool, quiet evening is 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes. Alan is a young man of his time, with the easy confidence of youth and a life that is only just beginning to unfurl. He has spent the earlier part of the evening visiting a friend in the city, enjoying the simple, mundane warmth of a social call. Perhaps they shared a laugh over music or talked about the coming week, oblivious to the fact that this would be the final anchor of normalcy in Alan's life. As he prepares to leave, the warmth of the house feels like a protective layer, but the moment he steps across the threshold, the winter air bites at his skin. He adjusts his jacket, pulling it tighter against the draft, and begins the journey that he believes will lead him to the safety of his own bed. Listen to the rhythm of his footsteps on the concrete. The sound is solitary and rhythmic, echoing slightly against the low fences and the manicured hedges of the suburban gardens. In 1979, the concept of a long walk home at night was not yet a source of paralyzing fear for the youth of Adelaide. It was a time of independence, a time when the city felt like an extension of one's own backyard. Alan moves with a steady pace, his hands likely shoved deep into his pockets. He passes the dark silhouettes of eucalyptus trees, their leaves rustling like dry paper in the breeze. The shadows they cast are long and distorted, dancing across the white-painted stone of the garden walls. He is a small figure in a vast, sleeping landscape, a single heartbeat moving through the stillness of the northern suburbs. His path eventually brings him toward the more industrial arteries of the city, specifically near Grand Junction Road. This is a wide, asphalt stretch that cuts through the landscape, a place where the suburban quiet gives way to the hum of the occasional passing car. On a Monday night, the traffic is sparse. Each set of headlights that approaches appears first as a distant glimmer, a twin set of eyes cutting through the dark, before growing into a roar of engine and tires on wet road, then fading back into a whisper. Alan stands for a moment, perhaps considering the distance left to travel. The cold is more insistent now, settling into his bones. It is here, under the harsh, artificial light of the sodium lamps, that he makes a choice that many teenagers had made before him without consequence. He decides to wait, to see if a friendly face or a helpful stranger might offer him a ride home. The geography of Adelaide at night is a map of light and shadow. To the east, the foothills rise up like a dark wall, a boundary between the civilization of the plains and the rugged wilderness of the scrubland. Alan is positioned in the flatlands, where the grid of the city feels most rigid and predictable, But as the minutes tick by, the predictability begins to slip away. The air feels thinner, sharper. Every sound is magnified. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a power line, the clicking of a pedestrian signal. He is waiting in the liminal space between the safety of his friend's home and the sanctuary of his mother's house. He is a young man who expects to be home by morning, someone who has no reason to believe that the darkness holds anything more than the winter chill. Then a car slows. It is a white Holden sedan, an unremarkable vehicle that blends perfectly into the backdrop of late 70s Australia. It carries several passengers, a small group that seems, at first glance, like any other group of men out for a night drive. The windows are rolled down just enough for a voice to carry through the cold air. There is an invitation, a casual offer of a lift to bridge the remaining miles. The interior of the car looks warm. The dashboard lights a comforting green glow against the blackness of the night. Alan, tired from the walk and the biting wind, accepts. He opens the door, the hinges creaking softly, and slides into the seat. As the door thuds shut, the sound is final. The white sedan pulls away from the curb, its taillights two red dots disappearing into the gloom of Grand Junction Road. The walk home has ended, but a different journey has begun. The streets of Adelaide remain quiet, the wind continues to rustle the leaves, and the street lamps keep their lonely vigil over the empty pavement. No one watching would have known that a threshold had been crossed. The city of churches continues to sleep, unaware that the first thread of a terrible web has been spun. Alan Arthur Barnes is no longer a lone walker in the night. He has entered a world of shadows from which he will never return. For now, the night is still, and the secrets of what happened inside that white car remain hidden in the dark, as the vehicle carries him toward the Adelaide Hills, toward the reservoir, and toward a fate that would change the city forever. Breathe deeply now. The walk is over. The silence has returned. The clock on the wall in the hallway of the Barnes home has a specific, rhythmic tick. In the daylight, it is a comfort, a heartbeat for the house. But as midnight passes on this cold Monday, June 18, 1979, the sound becomes a heavy hammer. Every second that ticks away without the sound of the front door opening is a weight added to the air. Alan is 17. He is a boy of habit, a boy who knows his way through the streets of Adelaide with the confidence of someone who belongs there. When the evening news ended and the house grew still, his mother, Mrs. Barnes, found herself sitting in the kitchen. The linoleum is cold beneath her feet, the patterns of the floor tiles blurring into a gray haze in the dim light of the overhead bulb. She is waiting for the sound of gravel under boots, the fumbling of keys, the simple, mundane evidence of a son returning home. But the night remains stubbornly silent, save for the wind rattling the window pane in its frame. The kettle on the stove is cold now. It has been boiled twice, yet the tea remained unmade, sitting in the pot as a dark, forgotten thought. In these hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, the imagination is a cruel companion. Mrs. Barnes thinks of the route Alan was supposed to take after visiting his friend in North Adelaide. She pictures the streetlights, those orange sodium glows that cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. She wonders if he stopped for a moment to look at the stars, or if he was hurrying to beat the winter chill. The silence of the house is absolute. It is a thick, velvet presence that seems to absorb any small sound she makes. The scrape of a chair, the sigh of a woman who is beginning to realize that the rules of her world have shifted. The absence of a teenage boy is not just a lack of person. It is a vacuum that pulls all the warmth out of a room. By 5 in the morning, the first gray light of dawn begins to creep over the Adelaide Hills. It is a pale, sickly color that offers no real comfort. This is the time when the phone calls begin. Mrs. Barnes reaches for the rotary dial, her fingers cold and slightly trembling. The sound of the dial spinning back, the mechanical whir and click, feels unnervingly loud in the quiet kitchen. She calls Alan's friends, waking families from their sleep. Each conversation follows the same agonizing pattern. A sleepy voice answers, followed by a moment of confusion, and then the final, hollow answer. No, we haven't seen him since he left. Have you tried calling the others? The list of names is short, and it is exhausted quickly. Each no is a door closing. Each no makes the world outside feel vast and dangerously empty. The cord of the telephone twists around her wrist like a tether as she stands by the wall, staring out at a street that looks exactly as it did yesterday, yet feels entirely different. She walks down the hallway to Alan's bedroom. The door creaks slightly as it swings open. Inside, the air is stale and carries the faint scent of a 17-year-old's life, denim, old school books, and the lingering trace of a mild cologne. The bed is made, the sheets pulled tight, undisturbed and mocking in their neatness. A stack of records sits on the desk, the top one a local band he liked to listen to when he thought no one was paying attention. Everything is in its place, waiting for a person who should be there. This is the eerie stillness of a missing person's first morning. The objects don't know he is gone. The books don't know they won't be open today. Mrs. Barnes sits on the edge of the bed, the mattress barely dipping under her weight. She stays there for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of morning sun that manages to pierce through the curtains. The realization is hardening now, turning from a soft fear into a sharp, cold certainty that help must be sought. The walk to the local police station is a blur of cold air and the sound of morning traffic beginning to hum. In 1979, the atmosphere of a precinct is one of smoke, the clatter of typewriters, and a certain bureaucratic indifference to the dramas of the young. When Mrs. Barnes speaks to the officer at the front desk, her voice is steady but thin. She describes Alan, his height, his hair, the clothes he was wearing when he left the house. The officer listens, his pen hovering over a paper form. There is a look in his eyes that many families in that era recognized. A look that suggests a boy of 17 has likely just wandered off, perhaps to a party or a girlfriend's house, and will return when his hunger outweighs his desire for rebellion. The term runaway is mentioned, a word that feels like a physical blow. It is a label that dismisses the fear, suggesting that the silence from Alan is a choice rather than a tragedy. The report is filed, a thin sheet of paper added to a wooden tray, and she is told to go home and wait. Returning home is the hardest part. The house is no longer a sanctuary, it is a waiting room. The first 24 hours are nearly over. The sun begins its descent again, casting long, purple shadows across the neighborhood of Salisbury. The neighbors are returning from work, the sounds of car doors slamming and children calling out to one another filling the air. Life in Adelaide continues in its predictable, sun-drenched rhythm, blissfully unaware of the hole that has opened up in the Barnes family. Mrs. Barnes stands by the window, watching the street lamps flicker to life one by one. She is caught in the quiet absence, a space where time has stopped, and the only thing that moves is the slow, agonizing crawl of the second hand on the hallway clock. The city is settling into its evening slumber, but for one family, the nightmare is only just beginning to take shape in the darkness that gathers at the edges of the garden. The first day is done, and the silence has become permanent. The morning of June 24th, 1979, dawned with a biting, crystalline cold that only the South Australian winter can truly claim. In the Mount Lofty ranges, the air was a thick, silver mist that clung to the valleys and draped itself over the peaks like a heavy, wet wool blanket. It was a day of silence, the kind of quiet that feels weighted, as if the earth itself is holding its breath in anticipation of a sorrow it cannot yet name. The previous week had been a blur of frantic phone calls and desperate searches for 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes. But as the sun struggled to pierce through the gray canopy of clouds, the landscape of the South Para Reservoir remained indifferent, tucked away in the rugged embrace of the foothills near Williamstown. The reservoir itself was a sprawling, somber expanse of water, usually teeming with the life of the bush. But on this particular morning, the water levels were uncharacteristically low. This retreat of the tide had exposed a vast, muddy base, a dark and glistening floor of silt and sediment that stretched out beneath the towering skeletons of the gums. These trees, the river-red gums, stood like ancient sentinels along the banks, their bark peeling in long, bone-colored strips, their twisted limbs reaching toward the heavy sky. The scent of damp eucalyptus and stagnant river mud filled the air, a sharp and earthy perfume that settled in the back of the throat, grounding the senses in the raw reality of the wild Australian scrub. Two bushwalkers had set out early that Sunday, seeking the solace of the trails that wind through the reservoir's perimeter. For them, it was meant to be a morning of rhythmic movement and clear air, a way to shake off the winter lethargy. They moved with the steady pace of those familiar with the terrain, their boots crunching softly over dried leaves and scattered twigs. As they approached the South Para Bridge, a structure that spans a deep section of the reservoir, the view opened up, revealing the hollowed-out basin below. From their vantage point high above, the world looked like a monochromatic painting, all shades of charcoal, olive, and brown. But as they looked down toward the base of the bridge, toward the shadows where the concrete met the earth, they saw something that did not belong to the natural order of the bush. Down in the brown, slick mud, partially shielded by the overhanging branches of a massive gum tree, lay a figure. From the height of the bridge, it looked almost like a discarded mannequin, a pale splash of color against the dark sludge. There was a sickening stillness to the shape, an absence of the subtle movements that define a living creature. The hikers stood frozen for a moment, the wind whistling through the bridge's railings, a lonely, high-pitched sound that seemed to punctuate the gravity of what they were seeing. With a sense of mounting dread, they began the slow, treacherous descent down the embankment, their hearts hammering against their ribs, the cold air burning in their lungs as they moved closer to the water's edge. As they neared the base, the reality of the scene became undeniably clear. It was the body of a young man, resting beneath the gums in a posture that suggested a violent, unceremonious dumping. The low water level had failed to conceal him. The mud had instead acted as a pedestal for a tragedy. He was lying there, twisted and broken, his back apparently damaged by the fall from the heights above. But as the investigators would later discover, the most chilling aspect of the scene was not just where he was, but how he appeared. Alan's body had been meticulously washed, scrubbed clean of the grime of his ordeal, and redressed in clothing that his family would later confirm was not his own. It was a bizarre, clinical touch, a gesture of perverse care in the midst of absolute brutality. The major crime squad arrived as the afternoon light began to fail, their blue and red lights reflecting off the still, murky water of the reservoir. The scene was cordoned off, the bright yellow tape fluttering like a warning flag against the drab green of the scrub. Forensic officers moved with hushed tones, their white suits stark against the mud as they documented every inch of the area beneath the gums. They found no immediate clues, no struggle, no footprints that hadn't been washed away by the dampness of the earth. It was as if Alan had simply materialized there, a grim gift left by the shadows. The boy who had been missing for a week, who had celebrated his 17th birthday in a dark, unknown captivity, had finally been found, but the mystery of his final days was only just beginning to unfurl. The discovery at South Para Reservoir shifted the atmosphere of Adelaide from one of concern to one of cold, creeping terror. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a homicide of the most disturbing nature. The toxicology reports would later whisper of sedatives and alcohol, of a Mickey Finn, designed to steal a young man's consciousness before stealing his life. But in those first few hours, as the sun dipped behind the Mount Lofty ranges and the temperature plummeted toward freezing, there was only the heavy, oppressive silence of the reservoir. Alan lay there, beneath the ancient gums, a silent witness to a darkness that was starting to seep out of the city and into the very heart of the hills. The investigation was now a race against a killer who moved with surgical precision and haunting silence. The air inside the pathology lab is always heavy, a thick blanket of silence that tastes faintly of chemicals and cold metal. It is a place where the vibrant noise of life is filtered out, leaving only the clinical, quiet reality of what remains. As the doors swung open for 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes, the atmosphere shifted. Outside, the world was still grappling with the shock of his discovery at the reservoir. But here, under the unyielding glare of fluorescent lights, the investigation was entering its most intimate phase. The pathologist's table is a stage where the body tells its final story, a narrative written in bruises, chemistry, and the quiet language of biology. We must look closely now at the findings that emerged in those early hours, for they transformed a simple disappearance into something far more calculated and sinister than anyone in Adelaide had dared to imagine. When Alan was first examined, the most striking detail was not what was there, but what was missing. Despite being found beneath a bridge in a rugged reservoir area, his body did not bear the typical marks of the Australian bush. There was no deep-seated grime under his fingernails, no tangled debris in his hair, and no evidence that he had been struggling through the undergrowth for days. In fact, he was remarkably clean. It was as if he had been preserved in a vacuum, shielded from the very environment where he was eventually discarded. This cleanliness was the first crack in the initial theory of a random, panicked attack. As the pathologist began the external examination, it became clear that someone had gone to great lengths to present a specific image. Alan had been washed, his skin carefully cleared of the evidence of his final hours, and he had been redressed in clothes that felt disturbingly neat for a victim of such a crime. The timeline of Alan's disappearance and death provided the most haunting puzzle for the investigators. He had vanished on the 18th of June, 1979, yet the biological evidence suggested he had only died roughly 48 hours before his body was discovered on the 24th. This created a void of nearly 4 days, 4 long, silent days where Alan was alive, but entirely removed from the world. Where was he during those 96 hours? The forensic findings suggested he hadn't been wandering or lost. Instead, the lack of exposure marks indicated he had been kept indoors, held in a controlled environment. This realization was chilling. It meant that his captor was not a person of impulse, but a person of patience. They had secured a young man and kept him somewhere in the heart of the city or its suburbs, hidden in plain sight, while a desperate search was conducted just miles away. Toxicology reports added a new chemical layer to this captive mystery. Inside Alan's system, analysts found traces of alcohol and a sedative drug known as chloral hydrate, often marketed under the name Noctec. This was not the recreational profile of a teenager out for a night with friends. The presence of these substances suggested a deliberate effort to keep him compliant, perhaps even unconscious, for extended periods. The sedative is powerful, a hypnotic that would have rendered him helpless in the hands of his captors. It speaks to a clinical level of control, a predator who used medicine as a tool to bypass resistance. Imagine the silence of that room where he was held, the heavy, artificial sleep induced by chemicals, and the terrifying reality that his movements were being dictated by someone with access to pharmaceutical knowledge. It was a sophisticated method of subjugation that pointed toward a very specific type of offender. The physical injuries found on the table were the hardest to reconcile with the otherwise clean appearance of the body. There were signs of severe internal trauma, specifically injuries that suggested the use of a large, blunt object. These were not the wounds of a quick struggle or a fight for life. They were the hallmarks of a sexual sadist who took their time. The pathologist noted that the cause of death was massive internal bleeding, a slow and agonizing process. What made these findings even more disturbing was the juxtaposition of such brutality with the post-mortem care. Someone had inflicted terrible pain on this boy, yet after the light had left his eyes, they had taken the time to bathe him and dress him once more. This cycle of extreme violence followed by meticulous grooming suggested a deep, pathological obsession with control, both in life and in the stillness of death. As the final notes were recorded in the pathology report, the profile of the killer began to solidify in the minds of the detectives. This was not the work of a disorganized drifter. The use of specific sedatives, the precision of the injuries, and the calculated decision to hold a victim for several days before a clean disposal all pointed toward someone with a professional, perhaps even medical, background. This wasn't just a murder, it was an operation. The reservoir was merely a stage for the final act, a place to leave the evidence once it had been scrubbed of its most vital secrets. The forensic evidence had peeled back the curtain, revealing a predator who moved through Adelaide with a terrifying level of confidence and resources. The investigation was no longer just looking for a killer. They were looking for a shadow that knew how to heal as well as it knew how to hurt. And the hunt was about to lead them into very dark territory. As the clinical chill of the pathology lab faded into the background, a different kind of cold began to settle over the city of Adelaide. The findings from the report were no longer just ink on paper. They were the catalysts for a transformation in the collective psyche of South Australia. It was the winter of 1979, and the air felt heavier than usual, thick with a dampness that seemed to carry the weight of the secrets recently unearthed. When the news of Alan Barnes' fate finally breached the quiet walls of the morgue and reached the front pages of the morning papers, the city caught its breath. The headlines were stark, yet they could not possibly capture the visceral nature of the evidence. People read the words while standing on their porches, the crisp June air nipping at their skin, and for the first time in many years, they looked toward the Adelaide Hills not as a place of recreation, but as a vast, dark sanctuary for something predatory. The public reaction was not a sudden explosion of panic, but rather a slow, suffocating realization. Adelaide had long cultivated a reputation as a progressive, almost genteel city, a place where the traditional and the modern coexisted in a sun-drenched balance. But as the details of Alan's final days began to circulate through hushed conversations in coffee shops and local pubs, that balance shattered. Parents who once allowed their teenagers to hitchhike across the northern suburbs now found themselves gripping car keys with white-knuckled intensity. The simple act of a 17-year-old boy trying to get home from a friend's house in Salisbury had ended in a nightmare that defied local logic. There was a sense that the safety of the streets was an illusion, a thin veil that had been torn aside to reveal a hollow, hungry darkness. Playground swings sat motionless, and the evening streets, usually dotted with cyclists and walkers, grew quiet long before the sun had fully dipped below the horizon. What truly sent a shiver through the investigative teams and the public alike was the creeping shadow of a pattern. It wasn't just Alan. The detectives, sitting in dimly lit offices surrounded by growing stacks of case files, began to look back at the disappearance and death of Neil Muir just 2 months prior. Neil, 25 years of age, had been found in a garbage bag in the Port River, his body subjected to a level of calculated, almost surgical mutilation that mirrored the horrific injuries found on young Alan. Both had been sedated with chloral hydrate, a drug used for sleep that turned their own bodies into prisons before the end came. The realization was chilling. This was not a random act of violence, but a signature. The identical nature of the trauma, the use of specific chemicals, and the way the bodies were discarded suggested a mind that was organized, patient, and terrifyingly consistent. The whispers in the city began to coalesce around a single, terrifying thought, that a hunter was moving among them, one who knew exactly what they were doing. The atmosphere in South Australia during those months was one of quiet, pervasive dread. Every white sedan seen idling near a bus stop was viewed with suspicion. Rumors began to swirl about a group, a secret society of sorts, that moved within the higher echelons of Adelaide society. People spoke in low tones about the family, a name that had not yet been officially coined by the press, but was already forming in the minds of those who sensed an organized force behind the carnage. This wasn't the work of a lone, disheveled wanderer. The precision of the injuries and the ability to hold a victim captive for days without detection suggested resources and a terrifying degree of social cover. Men in suits, professionals with respectable lives, were suddenly viewed through a lens of doubt. The fear was particularly acute for the young men of the city, who realized that the very freedom they had enjoyed in this growing metropolis had made them targets for a predator who understood the rhythms of their lives better than they did themselves. In the suburbs, the silence was the most telling sign of the change. The evening news, anchored by familiar faces like Rob Kelvin, became a nightly ritual of anxiety. Families would gather around their television sets, hoping for an arrest but fearing another disappearance. Every time a phone rang late at night, a jolt of electricity would shoot through the household. The mystery of the white Holden sedan, seen by witnesses near the Grand Junction Road where Alan was last spotted, became a local ghost story. People looked for that car in every parking lot and on every stretch of highway, imagining the 3 or 4 figures inside, waiting for the right moment to offer a ride. The city was no longer a collection of neighborhoods. It was a map of danger zones, marked by the places where boys had vanished and where their remains had been returned to the earth. The reservoir, the river, the foothills. These names now carried a stain that no amount of winter rain could wash away. As the investigation deepened, the pressure on the South Australia police grew to a fever pitch. They were dealing with a ghost that left behind all too real footprints. The connection between Alan Barnes and Neil Muir was no longer a theory. It was a haunting reality that dictated every move the Major Crimes Squad made. They knew that if they didn't find the source of this malice soon, the list of names would only grow. The city waited, its doors locked and its windows shuttered against the cold, while the whispers continued to echo through the streets of Adelaide. The realization had finally taken hold. The monster was not at the gates. It was already inside, navigating the parklands and the quiet cul-de-sacs with the ease of a local. The hunt was no longer just about justice for one boy. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim a city that was slowly being consumed by its own shadows. The silence of the night was no longer peaceful. It was a reminder of all the things that could happen when the world wasn't looking. Inside the offices of the South Australia Police, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low, rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights that never seemed to fully sleep. The year 1979 had already left a permanent scar on the psyche of the detectives, but as the calendar turned and the initial shock of Alan Barnes' death began to settle into a cold, hard resolve, a new sensation took hold. It was the feeling of a puzzle being assembled in the dark. On the desks of the newly formed task force, manila folders began to stack, their edges softened by the constant touch of fingers searching for a connection. Outside, the streets of Adelaide were often slicked with a fine mist of rain, reflecting the city lights in a way that made the shadows feel deeper, more secretive. The investigators were no longer looking for a single isolated incident. They were looking for a shadow that moved with purpose, a predator that was beginning to leave a signature across the landscape of the city of churches. The focus turned sharply toward the files of young Alan Arthur Barnes, who was only 17 when his journey home was so cruelly interrupted. The medical reports were revisited with a more clinical, detached eye, looking past the tragedy to the terrifying technicalities of his end. They noted the presence of Noctec, a sedative that had rendered him helpless before the final, brutal acts were carried out. It was a sophisticated choice of drug, implying someone with a specific knowledge of chemistry or medicine. The injuries he sustained were not the result of a random, frenzied outburst, but rather a calculated, prolonged period of control. As the detectives laid out the photographs of the South Para Reservoir where his body had been recovered, they began to see the environment not just as a crime scene, but as a carefully chosen stage. The quiet of the reservoir, the isolation of the water, and the way he had been left, it all pointed toward a mind that found satisfaction in the total domination of a vulnerable soul. Then came the file of Neil Muir. It was August of 1979, only 2 months after Alan had been found. Neil was 25, older than Alan, yet he shared a vulnerability that the predator seemed to recognize. When his remains were discovered in garbage bags floating in the murky waters of the Port River, the city gasped in horror. The level of mutilation was unlike anything the local authorities had ever seen. It was described as having a surgical quality, as if the person responsible was intimately familiar with the anatomy of a human body. The legs had been removed from the hip joints with a precision that chilled the bones of the responding officers. Despite the differences in their ages and lifestyles, the common threads began to glow like embers in the dark. Both men had suffered identical, devastating internal injuries caused by a large, blunt object. Both had been discarded near water. The realization was slow and agonizing. The monster that had taken Alan Barnes had not vanished into the night. He had merely been waiting for his next opportunity. As the months stretched into years, the pattern did not fade. It merely evolved. In August of 1981, another name was added to the growing list of the missing. Peter Stogneff was just 14 years old, a child who had simply failed to return home after school. For nearly a year, his fate remained an agonizing mystery, a hollow ache in the hearts of his family. It wasn't until June of 1982 that a farmer in the rural area of Two Wells, north of the city, made a gruesome discovery while clearing scrub on his property. Among the ash and debris of a recent burn-off, the farmer found a human skull. When the forensic teams arrived, they found that Peter's body had been cut into 3 distinct pieces, a mirror image of the way Neil Muir had been treated years prior. The similarities were no longer a coincidence. They were a roadmap of a serial predator. The task force looked at the geography of the crimes, from the northern reservoirs to the southern river, and realized they were dealing with someone who knew the backroads and the blind spots of Adelaide with an intimate, predatory precision. The detectives began to chart these events on a large map in their headquarters, using colored pins to mark where the boys had last been seen and where they had ultimately been found. A chilling detail emerged during this analysis. The abductions often occurred on Sundays. There was a rhythm to the disappearances, a schedule that suggested the killer had a structured life, perhaps a respectable one, during the rest of the week. They spoke of the sedative drugs again, Noctec, and later Mandrax. These were not substances found easily on the street at the time. They were prescriptions. The investigators began to wonder if they were looking for more than one person. Could a single man manage such complex abductions, the drugging, the prolonged captivity, and the difficult disposal of remains? The term, the family, began to whisper through the hallways of the station. It suggested a loose, dark network of individuals who shared a twisted ideology and a hunger for the same kind of violence. This wasn't just a serial killer. It was a conspiracy of silence that seemed to have roots deep within the city's social fabric. The weight of this growing pattern was immense. Each file on the desk represented a life extinguished and a family destroyed. But for Task Force Adelaide, these files were also the only weapons they had. They spent hours comparing the handwriting of anonymous tips, re-interviewing witnesses who had seen a white sedan on the night Alan disappeared, and trying to find the point where the lives of Alan, Neil, and Peter might have intersected. The city of Adelaide, once known for its quiet charm and colonial elegance, began to feel like a cage. Parents held their children a little closer as the sun dipped below the horizon, and hitchhikers vanished from the roadside as the fear took hold. The predator or predators had created a landscape of anxiety. The detectives knew that every day they spent analyzing the past, the clock was ticking toward another Sunday, another disappearance, and another tragedy. The pattern was there, clear and undeniable, written in the blood of the innocent and the cold ink of the police reports. They were no longer just searching for a murderer. They were trying to stop a cycle of darkness that threatened to consume the very heart of South Australia. The air in the investigation room was often heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of cold coffee that had long since lost its warmth. It was in these quiet, late hours, when the rest of the city slept beneath a blanket of southern stars, that the detectives of Task Force Adela began to see the threads that connected the disparate lives of these young men. The weight of the evidence was no longer just a collection of facts. It had become a physical presence, a growing mountain of folders that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As they moved deeper into the mystery of Alan Arthur Barnes, the focus shifted from the random acts of a lone predator to something far more organized, far more calculated, and infinitely more chilling. The transition was subtle at first, a whisper of a pattern that suggested the killers were not hiding in the gutters, but perhaps walking among the very elite of Adelaide society. This was the moment the investigation truly turned its gaze toward the theory of a collective, a group that the public would soon come to fear as the family. When the body of 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes was recovered from beneath the bridge at the South Para Reservoir on that cold June day in 1979, there was something about the scene that troubled the seasoned officers. It wasn't just the tragedy of a life cut short. It was the eerie, clinical state of his remains. The reservoir itself was a place of isolation, where the water sat still and dark, reflecting the leaden sky of a South Australian winter. Beneath the bridge, the air was damp and smelled of earth and old stone. There, Alan was found, but he had not been discarded like trash. Instead, his body had been meticulously washed, every trace of the struggle or the journey scrubbed away with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Even more unsettling was the fact that he was dressed in clean clothes that did not belong to him. This was the work of someone who had a distorted sense of order, someone who viewed the victim not as a person, but as a project to be completed, and then presented back to the world in a state of artificial cleanliness. The post-mortem examination added layers of horror to this clinical presentation. The toxicology reports indicated that Alan had been drugged with a sedative hypnotic called chloral hydrate, commonly known as Noctec. This drug was a heavy hammer, designed to pull a person into a deep, unresponsive sleep. It suggested that Alan had been kept in a state of prolonged consciousness and unconsciousness, held captive for several days before his life was finally extinguished. The cause of death was massive internal blood loss, resulting from injuries that were as brutal as they were specific. But as the investigators looked at the growing list of victims, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, and later, Mark Langley, a terrifying commonality emerged. In the case of Mark Langley, whose body was found in the scrub of the Mount Lofty Ranges, the precision reached a level that could only be described as professional. A vertical incision had been made from his navel to his pubic region, executed with the steady hand of someone familiar with a scalpel. The area around the wound had even been shaved, mirroring the exact preparations one would find in a hospital operating theater before a major surgery. This was the shadow of the surgeon, a metaphorical figure that began to haunt the hallways of the police headquarters. The level of medical knowledge required to perform such acts, and the access to specific sedatives like Noctec and Mandrax, pointed toward a perpetrator with a background in the health sciences. Rumors began to swirl like mist through the streets of Adelaide, gathering strength in the shadows of the city's most prestigious institutions. People spoke in hushed tones about a group of high-profile men, doctors, lawyers, and influential businessmen, who shared a dark, predatory bond. They were said to meet in the quiet suburbs and the grand Victorian homes of the elite, protected by their status and a conspiracy of silence that felt impenetrable. The moniker of the family was born from this idea of a close-knit, secretive circle where loyalty to the group superseded the laws of the land. The detectives found themselves looking not just for a killer, but for a network of power that could shield its members from the light of justice. The very thought that the hands meant to heal were the ones inflicting such unspeakable pain was a weight that few in the task force could easily carry. The investigation's shift toward this surgical theory was further complicated by the trial of a local doctor in the early 1980s. He had been accused of the murder of Neil Muir, whose body had been dissected with such skill that it was originally thought to be the work of a professional butcher or a medical student. Although the doctor was eventually acquitted and maintained his innocence until his death, the trial served to solidify the public's belief in a sinister, high-level conspiracy. The detectives were now navigating a minefield of social hierarchy. Every lead that pointed toward a man of standing was met with resistance, a wall of polished manners and legal brilliance. Yet the evidence from the autopsy tables continued to tell a story that could not be ignored. The use of staples, the specific types of surgical tape, and the calculated removal of internal organs in some cases spoke of a killer who operated with a cold, detached curiosity. It was as if they were conducting a series of horrific experiments, using the young men of Adelaide as their unwilling subjects, secure in the knowledge that their positions in society made them untouchable. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a pale gold light over the steeples and the parklands, the members of Task Force Adela remained trapped in the darkness of their files. They were looking at a map of a city they thought they knew, only to find a hidden geography of pain and corruption beneath its surface. The shadow of the surgeon was no longer just a theory. It was a presence that seemed to linger in every piece of evidence they touched. They were no longer just searching for a man who picked up hitchhikers on Grand Junction Road. They were hunting a ghost that lived in the highest circles of power. The precision of the crimes, the calculated drugging of the victims, and the eerie cleanliness of the dump sites all pointed to a group that operated with the confidence of the protected. The family was out there, moving through the same streets as everyone else, hidden behind the respectability of their professions. And as the investigation moved forward, the task force knew that to break the silence of the elite, they would have to find a way to step into that shadow and bring the truth into the light, no matter how blinding it might be. The winter air in Adelaide on the night of June 17th, 1979, was more than just cold. It was a biting, damp presence that clung to the skin. It was the kind of evening where the mist rolled in from the Gulf St. Vincent, settling over the suburban streets and turning the orange glow of the sodium street lamps into hazy, refracted orbs. At the corner of Grand Junction Road, 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes stood with his collar turned up, his long blonde hair catching the occasional flicker of passing headlights. He had spent the previous evening at a friend's house in Prospect, a night filled with the easy laughter and aimless plans of youth. But as the darkness deepened, he was simply a boy trying to find his way home, unaware that he was standing on the precipice of a mystery that would haunt the city for decades to come. The road was a vein of movement through the quiet night, and it was here that the first threads of the investigation began to pull tight. Task Force Adela, still in its relative infancy, was faced with a fragmented puzzle. The initial reports from witnesses at Grand Junction Road were focused on a white Holden sedan. One passerby remembered seeing a youth matching Alan's description being picked up by a car carrying 3 or 4 people. The image was fleeting, a door slamming shut, the red glow of taillights fading into the gloom. But as the investigators began to peel back the layers of the neighborhood's activities that night, another vehicle began to emerge in the peripheral vision of the case. This was a blue sedan, a dark, unassuming shape that seemed to move with a predatory stillness through the back streets of North Adelaide and the surrounding foothills. While the white Holden was the immediate lead, the blue sedan became a phantom in the files, a recurring shadow in the statements of those who felt they were being watched from the curb. The detectives spent countless hours cross-referencing registration records, looking for a bridge between these two disparate sightings. The search for the blue sedan led the task force into a painstaking grind of physical canvassing. They moved through the suburbs of Prospect and North Adelaide, knocking on doors where the porch lights flickered against the winter wind. They were looking for anyone who had seen the car idling near the parklands or cruising the long, straight stretches of road that led toward the hills. Witness statements began to paint a picture of a vehicle that didn't quite belong, a car that appeared and disappeared with an unsettling rhythm. One witness described the hum of its engine as a low, guttural vibration that seemed to disturb the silence of the early morning hours. This wasn't just about a car. It was about the movements of a group that seemed to know the geography of the city better than the police themselves. The detectives mapped out the potential routes, tracing the path from the bright lights of the city center to the pitch-black winding tracks that ascended toward the South Para Reservoir. Inside the station, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the rustle of paper. Thousands of vehicle registrations had to be checked by hand. In 1979, there were no instant digital databases to provide answers with a single keystroke. Instead, there were rows upon rows of filing cabinets and the steady, rhythmic clicking of typewriters. Each lead on a blue sedan had to be verified, the owners interviewed, their alibis scrutinized. The investigators were looking for a needle in a forest of needles, trying to identify which blue sedan had been seen near the Tint Street intersection or lurking near the reservoir gates. They focused on the texture of the evidence, the specific shade of blue, the presence of a chrome bumper, the sound of a faulty muffler. Every detail was a potential lifeline for Alan, whose absence was now being measured in days rather than hours. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy weight that mirrored the oppressive weather outside. The focus shifted to the timeline of the night. If Alan had been picked up on Grand Junction Road, where had he been taken? The movements of the blue sedan suggested a journey that looped through the affluent suburbs before heading north. There were whispers in the gay community and among the street-frequenting youth of a group of men who operated with a terrifying impunity. The blue car was often linked to these whispers, a vehicle used to transport young men to private residences where the doors were locked and the windows were shrouded. The task force began to suspect that the blue sedan was more than a witness's mistake. It was a key component in an organized effort of abduction. They looked for connections between known associates who owned such vehicles, navigating a landscape of social privilege and hidden vices that Adelaide had long kept buried beneath its respectable surface. As the investigation pressed into the following week, the urgency reached a fever pitch. The weather remained unforgiving, with rain lashing the windows of the police cruisers as they patrolled the reservoir perimeter. The physical leads were growing cold, but the psychological profile of the family was beginning to take shape in the minds of the task force. They realized they were not looking for a solitary drifter, but a network. The blue sedan was a symbol of that network's mobility and its ability to hide in plain sight among the thousands of identical cars that filled the city's driveways. Every blue Chrysler, every blue Holden, every blue Ford became a subject of intense interest. The process was exhausting, a slow-motion chase through a labyrinth of suburban sprawl. They were chasing shadows, hoping that one of those shadows would eventually turn into a solid, verifiable fact that could lead them to the boy with the long blonde hair. By the time the calendar turned toward the 24th of June, the hope of finding Alan alive was beginning to fray at the edges. The focus of the task force narrowed onto the South Para Bridge, a lonely structure that spanned a steep drop toward the reservoir floor. The blue sedan had been seen in that vicinity, a dark shape against the tree line in the hours before dawn. The detectives imagined the car idling on the bridge, the engine ticking as it cooled, the silent figures moving in the darkness to dispose of evidence. It was a haunting image that fueled their determination to find the vehicle. They knew that if they could find the car, they could find the men. And if they could find the men, they could finally bring some semblance of peace to the Barnes family. But for now, the blue sedan remained a ghost, a fleeting memory in a witness's mind, and a silent participant in a crime that was about to break the heart of a city. The air in the forensic laboratories of Adelaide was different from the humid, desperate heat of the search parties. Here, the world was reduced to the sharp, clinical scent of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights that never flickered. As the days following the discovery of Alan Arthur Barnes stretched into a long, quiet summer, the investigation began to peel back the layers of a nightmare that was far more complex than anyone had initially feared. It was a transition from the chaotic grief of the reservoir to the silent, meticulous work of the microscope. Investigators found themselves standing at a crossroads, staring at a puzzle where the pieces were made of molecules and microscopic strands. They were no longer looking for a boy. They were looking for a shadow that left traces of itself in the most intimate and terrible ways. The silence of the lab was the silence of a building storm. In the quiet corners of the toxicology department, the results began to arrive like slow, rhythmic heartbeats. They found traces of chloral hydrate in the young man's system, a powerful sedative often found in a medication known as Noctec. This was not the work of a random, frenzied attacker. It spoke of a calculated stillness, a predator who used chemistry to silence his victims before the end. The presence of this drug suggested a period of captivity, a time when Alan was held in a state of artificial slumber, disconnected from the world while his captors moved around him. It shifted the narrative from a single moment of violence to a prolonged, agonizing sequence of control. The realization settled over the detectives like a cold fog. They were dealing with someone who was patient, someone who understood the weight of a heavy sleep, and someone who possessed the means to acquire such specific substances. As the investigators scrutinized the physical evidence, a chilling pattern began to emerge beneath the lens. The injuries Alan had sustained were not just brutal, they were precise. There was a surgical quality to the violence, an anatomical knowledge that suggested a hand familiar with the inner workings of the human body. This was not the messy aftermath of a common criminal. This was a signature. Rumors began to circulate within the police department, whispers of a group, a shadowy collective that the media would eventually name the family. The idea that a network of individuals, perhaps even those in positions of professional respect, could be involved in such darkness was almost too much to process. The investigation felt as though it were walking on glass, careful not to break the fragile threads that connected Alan to other missing boys in the city. Then a name began to surface, rising from the depths of anonymous tips and old police files like a slow-moving tide. Bevan Spencer von Einem. To the world, he was an accountant, a man of figures and spreadsheets, a person whose life was defined by order and balance. He was 38 years old, a tall man with a quiet demeanor that allowed him to blend into the gray background of suburban life. But the detectives began to notice the ways his life intersected with the locations where young men had vanished. They looked at his white sedan, a vehicle that had been seen cruising the streets at odd hours. They began to wonder if the accountant was keeping a double set of books, one for his profession and another for his appetites. The tension in the precinct was thick, a heavy blanket of suspicion that needed only a single spark of forensic truth to ignite. The breakthrough finally came from the smallest of things: fibers. Within the deep blue pile of the carpet in the suspect's car, and clinging to the fabric of the clothes the victims had been found in, were microscopic clues that defied coincidence. Forensic scientists spent hundreds of hours under the glare of their instruments, comparing the chemical composition and the dye lots of the blue strands. It was a slow, agonizing process, like counting grains of sand on a vast beach. Each match was a tiny victory, a microscopic bridge built between the victim and the suspect. They found that the fibers were not just similar, they were identical. The car, which had once seemed like a mundane tool of transport, was transformed into a mobile crime scene, a vessel that had carried the weight of a secret for far too long. The forensic evidence was building a cage, bar by microscopic bar. As 1983 approached, the weight of the evidence finally tipped the scales of justice. The arrest of Bevan Spencer von Einem was not a loud, dramatic affair, but a quiet, inevitable conclusion to years of painstaking labor. When the police finally moved, the atmosphere in Adelaide was one of held breath. The city had been haunted by the disappearance of its sons for so long, and the sight of the tall accountant being led into custody felt like the first break in a decade-long fever. Yet, even as the handcuffs clicked shut, there was a sense of unease. The investigators knew that while they had a man in their grasp, the shadows of the broader conspiracy still lingered in the corners of the case. The narrative was built on a mountain of circumstantial evidence and the silent testimony of the lab, and the struggle to secure a conviction would be just as grueling. The trial that loomed ahead was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning for a city that had lost its innocence. The prosecution meticulously laid out the timeline, the toxicology, and the undeniable presence of those blue fibers. They spoke of the white car and the sightings of Allen in the company of older men. But the defense was equally prepared, challenging the admissibility of the forensic findings and casting doubt on the links between the different murders. The courtroom was a theater of quiet desperation, where the details of a young life were laid bare for all to see. The tension was a physical presence, a hum in the air that never quite dissipated. For the family of Alan Arthur Barnes, the wait for justice had been an eternity of silent rooms and unanswered questions. And now, everything rested on the delicate and agonizing balance of the law. The heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court of South Australia swung open with a muffled thud, a sound that echoed through the heart of Adelaide in 1984. Inside, the air was cool and carried the dry scent of aged paper and floor wax. This was where the shadows would finally be dragged into the light. The room was packed with a crowd so still they seemed like part of the architecture, their eyes fixed on the empty wooden dock. Every seat was occupied, yet the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that marked each second with clinical precision. High windows allowed shards of pale winter light to slice through the dust motes, illuminating the polished benches. The atmosphere was thick with a collective, held breath, a city waiting for an answer. When Bevan Spencer von Einem finally entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. He did not look like the monster the public had imagined. He was an accountant, a man of ledgers and numbers, appearing mundane in his neat attire. He moved with a quiet, measured step, his face a mask of indifference as he took his place. To those watching, there was a chilling disconnect between his unremarkable appearance and the horrific details about to be laid bare. The trial was for the murder of Richard Kelvin, but the ghost of Alan Barnes was ever present, hovering in the periphery of every statement. The prosecution prepared to weave a narrative that would link these tragedies together, revealing a pattern of calculated cruelty that extended far beyond a single night or a single victim. The prosecution began by painting a picture of a predatory network, a series of events so coordinated they defied the logic of a lone actor. They spoke of the hitchhikers, the young men like Alan who had stood on the side of the road seeking a ride, only to be met by a nightmare. The courtroom listened as the details of the surgical nature of the crimes were first described. This was not just violence, it was a precise, methodical torture. The prosecutors spoke of the way the victims were held, treated as subjects for a dark curiosity. The mention of the family began to circulate, a name for a hidden society operating in the shadows. The tension was palpable as the link between 1979 and the present tragedy was forged through clinical language. The most haunting moments came during the testimony of the forensic experts. Dr. Colin Manock, the pathologist, took the stand with a calm that was unsettling. He spoke in measured tones about the injuries Alan Barnes and Richard Kelvin had suffered. He described the massive blood loss and the specific, horrific trauma that indicated the use of large, blunt objects. The courtroom was so quiet that the scratching of reporters' pens sounded like thunder. Manock detailed how the bodies had been meticulously washed and redressed in clothes that did not belong to them. This ritualistic behavior suggested a killer who felt a strange sense of ownership over their victims, a need to control even the final state of the bodies they left behind in the scrub and the quiet, desolate reservoirs. Then came the revelation of the drugs. The prosecution presented evidence of sedative hypnotic compounds found in the blood of the boys, specifically a drug known as Noctec. It was a detail that chilled the marrow of the city. Noctec had been used to keep the victims in a state of compliant, terrifying fog. When the investigators mentioned finding a bottle of this substance in Von Einam's possession, the focus narrowed. The accountant's reaction in his initial police interview, the sudden nervousness and the shifting alibi, was recounted for the jury. For the family of Alan Barnes, sitting in the gallery, these details were a confirmation of the long, drugged hours their son must have endured. It connected the trial back to 1979, proving that the shadows had been moving among them for years. As the defense began their cross-examination, the air shifted from somber to sharp. The lawyers attempted to pick apart the circumstantial nature of the evidence, questioning the reliability of the forensic matches. They challenged the testimonies of witnesses, painting a picture of a man being scapegoated for a city's collective fear. The legal maneuvering was a high-stakes dance performed under the watchful eye of Justice Mower. Despite the defense's efforts to cast doubt, the weight of the similarities, the drugs, the surgical precision, the choice of victims, created an invisible thread that the jury could not ignore. By the time the court adjourned, the people of Adelaide walked out into the cool evening air, feeling that the closed doors had finally cracked, revealing a truth too heavy to carry, yet too important to ignore. The South Para Reservoir lies northeast of Adelaide, a vast expanse of water cradled by the rolling, eucalyptus-scented hills. In the quiet of the night, the surface of the water is like a dark mirror, reflecting the cold, distant stars that have watched over this landscape for thousands of years. It was here, beneath the concrete arches of the bridge, that the world first truly felt the chill of a darkness it could not name. We look back now, more than 40 years later, at the summer of 1979, when the air seemed to hold its breath. The hills are beautiful, yet they carry a heavy silence, a stillness that speaks of things left behind and secrets buried in the red earth. The wind whispers through the scrub, a soft, persistent sound that reminds us of the fragility of peace. It is a place of profound solitude, where the only movement is the slow drift of clouds over the peaks. Alan Arthur Barnes was just 17 years old when he stepped into the unknown on that June evening. He was a boy with a whole life ahead of him, a birthday just around the corner, and a smile that his family would never see again in the light of day. But Alan was not the only one. We remember Neil Muir, whose life was taken at 25, Peter Stogneff, a mere 14 years of age, Mark Langley, who was 18, and Richard Kelvin, the 15-year-old whose abduction finally forced the city to look into the abyss. Each name is a heartbeat that stopped too soon. Each name represents a family whose kitchen table would always have an empty chair. The family murders became a label, a shorthand for a nightmare. But for those who loved these young men, the names were never just a headline. They were sons, brothers, and friends whose absence created a hollow space in the heart of South Australia that time has never managed to fill. The investigation into these crimes was unlike anything the city had ever seen. It was a search for a ghost, a collective entity known only as the family. The details that emerged during the trials were harrowing, with descriptions of medical-grade sedatives like Noctec and Mandrax, and the chilling surgical precision found on the bodies. It suggested a group of men who moved through the upper echelons of society, people who wore suits and held positions of respect during the day, only to disappear into the shadows at night. This was the true horror, the idea that the predator was not a stranger in the woods, but perhaps the professional sitting across from you at a dinner party. The questions that remain are like ghosts themselves. How many were there? How did they manage to evade the light for so long? The answers have often been obscured by suppression orders and the passage of time, leaving a trail of what-ifs that still linger in the cool evening air. Adelaide is a city of churches and parks, a place that prides itself on its grace and order. But the events between 1979 and 1983 changed the rhythm of the streets. Parents held their children closer. The once common habit of hitchhiking faded into a memory of a more innocent time. The silence of the hills became a heavy thing, a reminder that even in the most picturesque settings, shadows can grow long. The city learned a hard lesson about the nature of evil, that it does not always announce itself with a roar, but often with a quiet, calculated persistence. The legacy of Alan Barnes and the others is woven into the very fabric of the city's history. It is a legacy of vigilance and a commitment to never forget the faces of those who were lost. As the years turned into decades, the fear subsided, but the reverence for the lives cut short has only deepened. In the end, only one man, Bevan Spencer von Einem, was ever held legally responsible for one of these deaths. He spent 40 years behind the stone walls of a prison, a silent figure who took his secrets with him when he passed away on December 5, 2025. His death marked the closing of a physical door, but the metaphysical door remains slightly ajar. The justice system did what it could, yet it felt incomplete to those who believed the family was far larger than a single man. There is a weight to that incompleteness, a somber realization that the full truth may never be spoken aloud. But perhaps there is a different kind of justice in the way we remember. By speaking their names and acknowledging the light they brought into the world, we push back against the darkness that tried to claim them. The evidence files may be closed, and the courtrooms empty, but the memory of Alan and the others remains as steady as the hills themselves. Now, as the night deepens and the world around you begins to soften, we let the weight of these stories fall away. The South Para Reservoir is still, its waters untroubled by the wind. The eucalyptus trees stand as silent sentinels, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. The history of this place is written in the earth, but tonight, the earth is at rest. The echoes of the past are fading, replaced by the steady, rhythmic breath of the present. You are here in the safety of your own space, far from the cold hills and the questions of the past. The shadows are just shadows, and the night is a blanket of peace. Let your mind drift like a leaf on the water, moving slowly, gently, toward the horizon of sleep. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.